subject that I was volunteered to discuss with you all today was, it started off with what was the market like in the 60s and 70s, and then when I get here and I look at the program, I was about collecting Mexican coins in the 60s and 70s, and you may have a little different title. First of all, my name is H.T. Nance, for the few of you that I don't know already here. So welcome, and consider this a discussion. This is not a lecture. This is not a presentation. This is a reflection of what I experienced as a very young collector in the 60s and 70s, and it kind of led up to what I can call the golden period of Mexican numismatics, which was sometime in the 70s, 73, 75, 76. And I've got some documentation that kind of leads into this. So to get started, Mexican coin collection. Collecting coins is about people. It's about dealers, it's about mentors, it's about friends. Talk a little bit about the flow of coins, how they got from their original source, mostly in Mexico, where they went, and who were the individuals who helped with that flow of coins. And then a little bit about market influences. I'm going to start about 1976 with a book that was actually done by George Vogt, which was a revision done by Neil Utberg. Does anybody here not know who Neil Utberg was? I didn't think so. Everybody knows who Neil Utberg was. You can hear me okay?
I said we're all here because of him.
You're absolutely right. Let's look at some of his work. When Neil Utberg, first of all, let me tell you about my relationship with Neil Utberg. I never met the gentleman. I grew up 15 miles from where he lived in Edinburgh, Texas. I lived in Mission. I never once shared a conversation or met him personally, but I certainly am an appreciator of the work and his body of work. Okay, George Vogt purchased, to my knowledge, the copyright to all of Neil Utberg's work sometime in the early 70s, mid-70s. And what I want to start with is George dedicated this work, if you'll see the fourth line down here, dedicated to Neil S. Utberg, author, original author, the pioneer of Mexican numismatics. And in my view, he was the true pioneer and the really originator of knowledge about coins that paved the way for why we're here today. Now, what's interesting to me is George came up with a list of contributors to his work and effort. There are over 100 names on this list. I personally have had conversations or discussions with 23 people who are on that list. Other than Mike and I Mike is on it, Don Canapero, who you may know is here today. He's another one on the list. But at that time, it looked to me like George Vogt put everybody's name on there who had ever touched a Mexican coin. But he starts with Moises Verhowski. If anyone ever had the privilege of meeting him, a very interesting coin dealer in Mexico City who was a refugee from the Russian Revolution. I'm going to talk today about 3 or 4 or 5 people who are on this list. But the starting point is Neil Utberg, as I pointed out. He was the real pioneer, and he did a tremendous body of work who contributed immensely to why we're here today. Okay. Notice Colonial Mexico. Here's one of his earlier books, The Empire of Iturbide. He did tremendous work with a large number of the different aspects of collectibles of Mexico. Now, this was the second page out of that book. One thing that's interesting about Utberg, if you look at every book that he ever published, every catalog, he always had a disclaimer right here. This is not a price list. He was giving you information that went far beyond being just a price list. And he repeated this over and over as you go through all of his books. Yeah. And he calls it, this is an illustrated catalog of the numismatic history of Mexico to aid both the novice, which I certainly was, and the investor, and to enjoy collecting these coins. Now, George, of course, at this point owned the copyright, so he actually published the book. But George got it right. He started with Neil Utberg and gave Neil Utberg the recognition he deserves. Now, the challenge of collecting Mexican coins. Can you read this okay in the back? Okay. Well, when you're using a flatbed scanner with an old book that gets crooked sometimes when you scan it. Very interesting comments about collecting Mexican coins. He points out that Mexican coins were much more difficult to collect than American coins. That the availability wasn't nearly that of American coins. And then he gets down to the bottom, which is what I really wanted to focus on. Now that the commercials are over, I finished my commercial, Utberg has finished his. Let's get down to the nitty gritty. Here's what he thinks are the attributes of collecting coins. What does he see in a coin? The history of it, the culture, the markets, everything. Starts with romance. Now, I don't know if I see romance in a coin or not. Then he goes to violence. Well, if you've ever collected ancient coins, studied Rome, you got all kinds of violence and the history of those coins. Beauty, yes. Tragedy, yes. History, absolutely. Ugliness, well, I guess that's a word too. And then he gets into art. These are the things that Utberg gave some recognition of in his body of work as I discovered going through it. Let's take a look at some of it. Starts with Numismatic Sidelines of Mexico, one of his books. He didn't just focus or do research on coins. Let's take a look. Right down the list. Medals, hacienda tokens, errors, counterfeits, oddities. Cut and counter-stamped coinage. Now, Utberg was also a fisherman. He actually had pictures of him fishing in his catalogs. The reason I show you this one leads into our discussion of where did we go to find the coins. In this book, the line up there, if you can't read it, is a photographic tour of a portion of the collection of the Banco de Mexico in Mexico City. So Utberg was one of the people who lived in South Texas. Remember, we lived in South Texas. From Brownsville to my home of Mission is what we used to consider the lower Rio Grande Valley. If you want to go further up the river, then it's Laredo. But a large flow of Mexican coins was coming across that border for many years by people who were reading Utberg and learned coins from Utberg who decided to become collectors like myself or dealers. Coins of Mexico, next, another book he did early on. This is not a price list. An itemized and an illustrated catalog of the history of Mexico. He considered himself a historian and a writer more than somebody who's going to give you what a coin's worth. Now, what's impressive about Utberg is the variety, the different disciplines that he dealt with in writing and researching about coins, particularly coins of Mexico. Next page in that last cover, second edition. So you see the ending date's 1962, very early on. This is not a price list. Then you go into the catalog itself. Here we are. Some of his illustrations from the Banco de Mexico. Now, this was being published by Utberg in the early 60s. Okay. Enough about Utberg, but we are all greatly indebted to him. Now,
Was he a dealer?
what?
Was he a coin dealer? Or was he-
Yes, he was. He dealt out of his house, and we have a guy who works in our office who's actually been in his house. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about Neil Utberg, the little that I know. He had a coin shop somewhere in Edinburgh for a while, I am told. Never been there, never saw it. Something happened in his life, and I'm not sure what it was. I Googled him, and I found an inquiry by somebody in Europe who had sent a questionnaire to someone. And he was asking, did Utberg get out of coins because of the robbery? I know of no robbery, but he may have been robbed or something. Anyway, he somewhat abruptly left the profession and sold the copyright of all of his work to George Vogt. Now, the gentleman whose name I mentioned is actually on that list, if you can believe it or not, is Tom Bankston. If you know Tom, Tom works for us. And Tom tells me that he was in Utberg's house sometime in the 60s, and that when Utberg left the coinage field, he went into repairing and sharpening lawnmowers. I find that hard to believe, but that's one story I've heard. I just don't know how accurate it is. But in any event, I don't know when he died or when he passed away, but it was sometime later on up in the 80s, I believe. The next gentleman I'm going to talk a lot more about. If I could have a show of hands, how many people, if any here, knew of Harvey Bruns? You've heard the name. Okay. Harvey Bruns was from Mission, Texas. He was my high school football coach and also the track coach, and I was his runner. We'd go on track trips, and Harvey would get change. And he'd always look at the change. One day I asked him, what are you doing? He says, I'm looking for nickels minted in Denver in 1950. That was my first introduction in my life to someone who collected coins. I never forgot that. He told me a little bit about it. Harvey was a bigger, larger than life person. Stood about 6'4". He was an All-American football player in college. When he was coaching me when I was in high school, he could outrun everybody but me, and I was a sprinter. I could actually outrun him. But he was big, agile. He was a hunter. He knew every deer blind in South Texas. He knew every duck blind in South Texas. He knew where every fishing hole was. I've been with him going to those kinds of places. He, in the mid to late 60s, he started dabbling in coins. Now, to go back in a little history about Harvey Bruns, when he went to the first grade, he could not speak English. He was German, grew up in Kerrville, Texas. His interest in coins was generated by Mrs. Howard E. Butt. This story was told by his daughter. The H-E-B grocery stores in South Texas, apparently they originated in Kerrville, Texas, which was where Harvey was from. And he was as a very young kid, he had a paper route. And somehow he was delivering papers to Mrs. Howard E. Butt, and they developed a relationship, and she encouraged his interest in collecting coins. That's how it started. Harvey would travel into Mexico, and he would bring back enormous quantities of various things. Some of those various things, coins of course, he would bring them back in bags, he would bring them back in buckets. He also brought back arrowheads. On one trip he made, when I happened to be at his house and he came back and saw a lot of this stuff, he had found a casino in Guatemala. I didn't know there were any casinos in Guatemala. He bought back a ton of US coinage, almost literally, which he got at face value. Barbers $50, Barbers 25. I say, you second, do you know something about this, with American coins being available in Central America in that period, in the early 60s? Yeah.
No, I thought it was a history about how a guy from here found a board of Guatemala, 1 real, so
Okay.
in a bank.
He bought back cobs, although not very many, and he never really perked an interest in me in cobs. Some other names that were on the list I showed you a while back. Does anyone know who Ken Tabachnik is? Okay, everybody knows Ken Tabachnik. He's been going to the Long Beach shows for years. Ken Tabachnik and his partner Joel Blumenthal used to get in their automobile and drive to Mission, Texas to get coins from Harvey Bruns to take back and sell in California. Harvey was one of his principal suppliers. If you know who Dick Long was, which we'll talk more about a little later, Harvey also was a supplier of Dick. Yes, sir?
I know who it was.
Okay. He moved immense amounts of material. Art Garnett is another name. I doubt that anyone would know who he is. He lives in Southern California. Okay. Art told me this story. When Harvey would travel to the Long Beach Coin Show, the dealers out there knew where his table was. According to Art, people would line up in front of his table before he arrived to get first shot at whatever material he had that he was bringing back out of Mexico. He'd get in his pickup truck, he'd drive across the border, and he'd come back 3 or 4 days later with just a ton of stuff. A lot of merchandise. You see, you've been looking at the slide here. Don't panic, the Internal Revenue Service is not after us yet. In 1969, it happened to be the year I came back from a tour I'd served in Vietnam. I was a young major, I was a pilot, and I had some money for the first time in my life. I could actually buy a coin or two. There was a family that was arrested in El Paso. And when the government came in, they found this hoard of Mexican paper money, Mexican coinage, and just about anything you want to name, including one 1799 US dollar was on the list, and everything in between. Does anybody here remember this sale? I have a copy of it, and I'll show you 2 coins that I bought out of it because Harvey discovered both of them. He had to hire, he told me, 6 people plus himself, and they spent around 8 days going through barrels of coins and sorting them out to sell them. The Internal Revenue did the sale. It was mail bid. You just said one time. They did put a reserve, and I bought 2 coins on which they had a reserve. If you can read it, you see where I've annotated in yellow? That's an 1899 1 centavo. And they put a $100 reserve on it. I purchased that coin for the princely sum of $180. The other coin was a 1931 5 centavo. I purchased that coin for $280 when there were not very many known. There's been a lot more discovered since then, but those were the first major coins that I bought because I had just come out of Vietnam, I survived a year, and I was getting combat pay plus flight pay. I was rich for a short period. But this was a truly amazing sale. Amongst other things, they found a lot of circulated 14 caballitos, which are listed individually in the list. There were 140,000 articles that were cataloged. Some in lots of 200 or 300, some in lots of one. And Harvey, this is what he had to say. This is the most significant group of coins, metals, currency, not in a collection, that I have examined in my 30 years as a collector and dealer. Now, I knew Harvey well, and that tells me that he started collecting coins when he was 6 years old, because that's how the math would work out. But he had actually told me individually about these two coins, and he told me, you should buy those two coins. I took him at his word, followed his advice, and never regretted it. He knew his coins, he knew what he was doing, and you'll find that he was not a writer like Neil Ludwig. He was an entrepreneur. If something was out there, Harvey could go find it, get it, bring it back. I'll tell you one quick story. In his later years, Harvey's love for fishing led him to having a hunting cabin in Alaska where he went to hunt and fish. He had a lady friend. Mr. Harvey was in his 50s at this point. And he'd be somewhere, decide to go somewhere. So he's in Alaska. The Soviet Union collapsed. He decided to go to Siberia. So he calls his girlfriend in Weslaco, Texas, says, get me over to Siberia. So he wound up on some kind of a puddle jumper, a small transport airplane, landed in Siberia. And he had some very interesting stories about what he saw, because he landed at a military base. This would have been around 1992. Nothing to do with coins, except he had a very compelling interest in young people. There were no hotels where he landed in Siberia. So he ended up staying with a family, a Russian Siberian family. They had some young sons. Within the year when he came back, he arranged for those two young sons to come and spend time in the USA. He had a real interest and almost a compulsion of handling young people. Another name I believe was on the list. Maybe I shouldn't tell this story, but I will. When Harvey would go to a coin shop, I'm going to come to another story about him with me. But he went to the 1992 ANA, if I recall correctly. It was in Washington. I happened to have been stationed in Washington that year. Harvey showed up and spent a night at my house. But he had already set up at his table, and somehow he spent the night with me, so I drove him back into the ANA the next morning. And he had not told me about this coin, but I looked in his case, and there sat the nicest 49 peso I've ever seen. And I still haven't seen one better, although I've seen some really nice ones that I didn't know existed in those days. And I told him, I said, Harvey, I'd really like to consider buying that coin. He said, well, it's $300, and I was outraged. $300 for a $200 coin? No way. Anyway, Harvey was German, and his diet consisted of beer, beer, and beer. On one visit he spent with me when I lived in Florida, I saw him consume 36 cans of beer in one day, one calendar day, starting early in the morning, ending up around midnight. Never slurred a word, never showed any signs of being inebriated. He just drank a lot of beer, and I caught up with him before too many years, and he wound up coming down with gout when he was in his early 60s. But his ability to consume beer was legendary. You did not want to go drinking with Harvey Brooks. Well, I did. We went to a little Rathskeller in Washington, D.C. after I'd looked at that coin. And we talked about it. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, Harvey was as honest as the day is long. We reached across the table, shook hands, And I said, I'll buy the coin for $300. I took him back to the show the next morning. We walked in. Of course, he's pulling the cloth off of his exhibits and his cases. And to put it in context, if you know Pat Johnson had a table next to him. If the name Jim Shipley means anything to you, he was in the show later that day. But this gentleman walked in, coat and tie, very distinguished, and someone you could just look at him and tell that he was somebody that probably could afford expensive coins. And he put his finger right on the coin that Harvey had agreed to sell me and said, I want that coin. Although he had his finger on the glass, the coin was underneath. And Harvey says, I'm sorry, sir, I cannot tell her. He knew the gentleman. He says, I cannot sell it to you. The gentleman said, Harvey, you didn't understand me. I want that coin. The conversation started to get heated. So, being as naive as I was, I tapped Harvey and said, Harvey, go ahead and sell him the coin and you can replace it later. He looked at me and I'll never forget what he said. He says, I will never be able to replace that coin. That coin is still in my collection today. But the point was, he could have sold that coin for 2 or 3 times the money that I paid him for it. Because that gentleman there recognized it for what it was. Don't know who he was, what his name was, or anything. But Harvey was an extremely honest, man of his word individual. In his catalog, if anybody would like to read, this thing is very interesting. If you would like to, I don't know of anywhere else there's another copy. I'd be happy to lend it to anybody who's doing research who would like to see what's in there. There were some unknown revolutionary pieces that Harvey also found. This was about his 3rd page, and what does he do? He's got references. Every reference was, guess who? Neil Eckberg's catalog numbers. Every one. Enough about Harvey. This now leads us to somebody named Dick Long. Dick started, as I said earlier, in Corpus, also resided in Baton Rouge for a while. One of the stories about Dick was, and we'll get to buttery in a minute, this was the first buttery book. I lost my copy. I just got this today. Corey Max had it in here on the table. The 1915 Zapatista, the 1 centavo and the 2 centavo, Zapata's forces occupied Mexico City in 1915, and they produced the reduced size centavos and 2 centavos. But they didn't stay there very long, so they were fairly rare. And this book, that's an NBU. That's an $80 coin. They were really hard to find. And wherever I would go, I'd meet coin dealers, and they'd always ask me, I'd like to get a copy, or I'd like to get one of these 1915 reduced size 1 centavos. I said, I got one, but that's in my collection. It wasn't a very nice one. And then Dick Long got into the act. Dick went into Mexico, Dick also going to Mexico. He met a priest, according to the story, he told me, in Mexico, and I don't know what the city was, I don't know who the priest was. The guy had a hoard of the reduced size 1 centavos zapatistas. There were about 1,500 coins in the hoard. So when Dick came back, and the catalog on this, of course, they went from $80 coins to about $20 coins. And they sold very well, because this leads me into something, and I'll come back to where I want to talk about one other person. What caused people to have an interest in Mexican coins? And what made it easy? There was no internet. You couldn't pull up your iPhone and look at a coin and find out what it was worth. So one of the first ones was something like this. This is edition 4, 5, 6, and 7. I don't know what happened to my editions of 1, 2, and 3. They were all done by Harvey Burns. Just a nice little checklist, tells you what the coins are worth. and has a place where you can annotate your own information of what you want to do. That was a big help to people like me who just couldn't remember all this stuff. But boy, I could remember if I had one of these in my hip pocket. A lot of people would come to coin shows with these little checklists going down the list, like Bill Siegel does with things today. And bingo, Dick Long did the same thing. Almanzar was another one. Several people did those kinds of lists. One of the things that I think had as much impact right here. Dansko did this very nice typeset album. And I can remember people coming to shows with those albums under their arm, buying type coins of Mexico. That was a very popular coin. Well, I put together a set one time, and every coin was BU. And I used my 49 Morelos as my Morelos type. That did catch a couple of eyes. But that generated a lot of interest in Mexican coins. I skipped a name a while ago. You cannot talk about Mexican coins without thinking about Clyde Hubbard. Clyde Hubbard's name is not on this cover. Clyde's name is on the next cover. And of course, Clyde knew everything had to do with Mexican coins, and everyone, I'm sure, at one time or another, on their trips into Mexico, would manage to meet Clyde Hubbard. Certainly the dean of Mexican numismatics, whereas Utberg was the pioneer. Anybody have any questions or anything you'd like to add to this? Lynn?
There's obviously it was a generation.
Excuse me, I have a hearing problem.
There must have been a generation of collectors before that, because Howland Wood did publish
Howland
some
Wood is
books,
another name I was familiar with in
who
those years.
published some works before Utberg,
Yeah.
and some monographs
Yeah.
on the dollars and a few other things. So Utberg was the name that got me started when I got that book, but there were others before
I
him.
don't recall ever meeting Holland Watts. I did hear about it.
And I know that there are various auction catalogs and people who were focusing on Latin American and Mexican material, not in the Texas, not in the southwest area.
I'm just giving my personal
Well,
experience.
yeah, no, what I'm curious about is whether, say the Christensen sales or other things had an impact on the group of people that we're talking about here. Was there communication with sort of that more northeast?
Yeah, and a lot of Mexican coins came back to the States out of Europe. I mean, they came from everywhere. I can only address what I experienced personally, seeing what was happening when I was growing up in Mission, Texas. And then later on, when I was serving in the Marine Corps, I really got my interest in collecting, and I would always come back to Harvey for a while. Most of us remember Clyde Hubbard walked in the show 3 or 4 years ago. Either 99 or 100 years old, flew by himself, no one was with him, just an amazing gentleman. And if you've never met the individual, he's just as an impressive of a guy as you could ever hope to meet. Now, in conclusion, let me see, I didn't really take that long. There was a new force in the market in the 70s. I have that collector's first price list. When you clean out boxes in your attic, you'd be amazed at what you find. You'll see a little yellow streak circle with red ink there if you can read it. That's a 1920 2/1 1 peso that this dealer had for sale. Would anybody like to guess who the dealer was?
Almanzar?
Coins of Mexico.
Mike.
I'm gonna read this to you because it's gonna be, I can't get this thing focused to where it comes out clear. Although I have been dealing in coins of, this was written in 1974. Although I have been dealing in coins of Mexico for several years, this is my first major ad in a numismatic publication. I hope to gain many new friends and clients in addition to renewing contacts with many old ones. And he goes on with some very nice comments. That dealer was Mike Dunnigan, who was also on the list of contributors. That leads me to my last slide. Where does Mexican numismatics go from here? Anybody have any thoughts or comments? Because I don't know. What will Mexican numismatics be 100 years from now? Or 200 years from now? Will there be interest in the hobby? I don't know. We don't know. I do know this, that there's some things driving the market that are driving people out of it. Hey, I stayed, but I paid an ungodly sum of money to buy a coin I'd been looking for 50 years. But the registry set owners, of course, forced the price up. So I paid a huge amount of money for one coin I could have purchased 40 or 50 years ago for less money if I could have found one. It's a very rare coin. So unless people have comments, anything to add, tell me I'm wrong, because I could well be. And again, I'm only sharing with you my personal experience and what I saw. One parting Harvey Brune story, when he went to the ANA, he really got their attention. Put out a bowl of pennies. He put out a bowl of arrowheads. He also used to bring back pre-Columbian artifacts. So there's two subjects I've talked about that are somewhat taboo. Pre-Columbian material, which wasn't really illegal in those days, but now you couldn't touch a thing down there. You'd violate laws in both countries. And to a lesser degree, the stuff that came off the Padre Island wrecks, where Harvey was one of the guys who knew how to go down after a hurricane and pick the coins off the beach. And I'm convinced that a lot of material that I saw out of those wrecks when I came to work for Mike in 1989, count the calendar, that's 31 years ago this year. I'm convinced a lot of those came through Harvey Brune's hands. Yes, sir.
You left out the actual founder of the USMEX19, Don Bailey.
His name is also on the list, and Lois is set up right next to us. There are many, many other names I could mention, I just didn't. And I did business with Don. I did not know Don in the early years. Don happens to be, or was, before he passed away recently, he was a medically retired gunnery sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. You happen to see the jacket I'm wearing? We were soulmates all the way through. First time I met Don Bailey, he had a coin shop, if I recall correctly, in Yuma, Arizona. And I don't even remember what year that was. But he did have a coin shop from then for many years. And of course, Don was the pioneer in the Maximilian phenomenon, which I guess there just wasn't enough material to sustain itself. So the Maximilian fad kind of went on the wayside. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I know you first met Mike at an auction. How well known were the various major auctions to, collectors at that point? Right now, on the internet and everything else, we all hear about all of the auctions going on all over the world. How much information when you were collecting did you ever hear about auctions?
Well, the major, the Goldbergs did a lot of Mexican material. Superior, of course, did a lot of Mexican material. My first encounter, does anyone recall the Wolfson sale, WLFSON? I was a young Marine major stationed in Hawaii, and I went down and bought a plane ticket for the first time in my life to go to a coin show. Flew back to Los Angeles, and walked in there, and by this time I was a little more capable of buying coins, thinking I knew what the coins were worth. I was blown away. Just, things were bringing 2 and 3 times what I thought they were worth based on my experience and information. And that was kind of a golden period. You could get good coins because a hot market brings the good coins out. The difference is you had to pay a lot more money for the coins. That list that I showed you, Mike Dunnigan's first list, there were incredible coins on that. You can imagine knowing Mike.
You didn't really go into George Vogt much, and you must have had contact with him early on. George Vogt?
Mhm.
I mean, Mike worked for George. And
I first met George Vogt in 1968. I was in McAllen, Texas. Harvey actually opened a coin store on Main Street in McAllen where you're going south towards the bridge at Reynosa. And he was going to cash in on the Olympic market. Okay? And I happened to be there one day. I was in uniform, fixing to go to Vietnam for my second tour. And I met George Vogt that day. And yes, George certainly is worthy of mention as a major player. He did, I guess, come to Mission. Anyway, he was pretty close to Harvey. They did a lot of business together.
millions of dollars.
And it was Harvey who introduced me to George. George remembers that to this day. Yes, sir.
I don't think I've met Dr. Vogt, but Don Bailey told me a story about him. You mentioned that Vogt bought Uttenberg's copyrights, and then later Krauss came out with a book which Vogt claimed violated those copyrights because Vogt took Uttenberg's listings and then Krauss took Vogt's listings and put it in theirs. This is the story that Bailey tells. I wasn't there, before my time. That then Vogt sued Krauss and Mishler for doing that, and according to Don Bailey, they did their homework and discovered that Uttenberg had never copyrighted his books.
But he sold the copyright that he hadn't
When he sold the
copyrighted.
copyright to Vogt, it wasn't a valid copyright, and so Krauss was perfect. It was in the public domain, and Krauss could take those listings, and they didn't know Vogt anyway.
All I know is George put out a big Mexican coin book, and there were some issues with whose name was on the cover and who had the right, and they did a reproduction and took somebody's name off. Don't remember the names. That may have been part of the episode you're talking about.
They put a sticker on the cover that Gold's name on it.
What happened was they put out the first edition that had Bruce and George Vogt's name on it.
No, that was the
No,
second.
the first one just had George. The second one had, just had Colin Bruce because somehow George was out of it. George sued him, and they
Yeah.
took back all the books that had not been distributed. You will have a label sticker adding George Vogt's name to it. And you can get both the books now.
I think I've seen them, yeah.
And that's why that sticker's on there. So that's how they settled the suit ultimately. I don't think any money changed hands. You know, one other thing that's real interesting in this period that people that came in later don't understand where the laws were so much different back then. I was dealing in coins in the same period in the early 60s. I lived in Corpus Christi, and I'd drive down to Matamoros, cross the border, meet my suppliers there, and pick out the coins I wanted. And gold coins were illegal to export from Mexico at that time on the Mexican side. Coins dated after 1933 were illegal even in the US. We were still under the embargo. So I would pick out the coins I wanted. I would only pick out the early date 50 pesos or 20 pesos. We'd agree on a price. I'd drive across the border, and 10 minutes later he shows up. We exchange coins and money, and off I go. All that gold that was being taken out of Mexico at that point in time was all smuggled into the U.S. from the Mexican point of view.
You'll notice I didn't use the word smuggling in my presentation. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
They weren't illegal once they weren't illegal in the US once they were here. But I mean, the fellow that worked for Pat Johnson forever. Jed, he would tell me stories of him walking across the border with real high cowboy boots with gold stuffed down both legs to bring it across. I mean, it was, it's amazing. You talk to George and he would tell you that they ship literally train carloads of silver that he would buy and then ship to the smelters up north. Literally train carloads of the Cuauhtemocs, the 720 pesos, the 900 fine 5 and 10 pesos. It was a lot different than it is today.
The IRS sale had a tremendous amount. There was some gold in there as well, if I recall. But Harvey said it was about 80% Mexican material. There was also paper money. Or maybe I did, but they were arrested. The family was arrested, according to Harvey, for smuggling. And one of the things he mentioned was guns and weapons. But that would have been back during the Revolution, I think, not in the 1950s or 60s. My voice is just given out, and I didn't use the help assistance one time. So thank you very much. And,